Thomas Marco Seibold lived in Three Lakes, Wisconsin, and traveled to Alaska in June 2012 to put years of survivalist training into practice in the state's backcountry. A native of Germany, Seibold had spent the previous 6 years training at the Teaching Drum School, a survivalist education center that teaches Native American values along with weather forecasting, shelter building, as well as primitive hunting and gathering techniques. During this time, Thomas almost died in the Minnesota boundary waters due to injuring his leg with an axe. He nearly bled to death before emergency personnel could reach him. While his friend went for help, he told him to stay put so that his leg would not bleed as quickly. But Thomas tried to walk out on his own anyway. He had a risky side to his personality. During the winter time, he would spend days or weeks at a time in the forest, and he would live in the primitive handmade shelters and live off of handmade snare line. He made his own clothing from animals he had eaten and his own gear. In summer, he would stay out for an entire month at a time in the wilderness and had been doing so for years in the Wisconsin Northwoods. He was described as incredibly capable in the wild, quiet and kind and cheerful, a gentle soul with a powerful drive to live the way he believed was best. He spent much of his time under the tutelage of the school's founder, Tamarack Song, who described Seibold as a very experienced outdoorsman and a, quote, wandering spirit. To make the trip to the Arctic, Seibold had taken a 6-month leave of absence from the outdoor school. In September 2012, Thomas headed for a cabin just outside of Gates Arctic National Park and Preserve in Alaska. He left there and headed into the national park and was never seen again. On September 27, 2012, Thomas said goodbye to the Schneibers and headed off into the gates of the Arctic National Park. That was the last time he was ever seen. He was expected to be back in touch between the end of October and the beginning of November, with November 10 being the cutoff date to catch his flight back to Wisconsin on November 15th. It is clear that something happened which prevented Thomas from following his plans of trekking 30 miles to the town of Kobuk, where he would take his plane back to Fairbanks and then on to Wisconsin. Alaska State Police were alerted on November 11, 2012, when he failed to show for the flight, and they quickly focused their search near the confluence of the Ambler River and the Ulani Creek, where they believe Seibold may have built a base camp. Headed up by Sergeant Dwayne Stone, immediately launched a search and were initially confident in finding him, as he had camped alone in extreme northern wintertime climates before, including reindeer hunts in Norway in minus 25-degree temperatures. Thomas was highly trained in primitive survival skills, including building snow shelters, ice safety, making fire, and orienteering without a map or compass. Troopers found Thomas's diary in the cabin, and the last entry was October 7th, where he stated he was preparing to go on a multi-day exploration trip. The troopers found no evidence of him being at the cabin after that approximate date. In it, he described as hiking and camping higher up in the mountains, exploring for the potential campsite. He also talked about cleaning and preparing wood at the cabin for the colder weather ahead, which suggests that he was planning to return there. The SAR search and rescue team inspected the cabin and found that he had taken most of his gear, including at least one .22 caliber rifle and enough meat and provisions to last him a while, but found no sign to guide them to his whereabouts. Due to the severe weather conditions, minus 23 degrees Fahrenheit, the short daylight hours, and the remoteness of the area, the search faced big logistical issues in getting planes to the target areas. Snowmobiles were not able to be used in the search because there were only 3 inches of snow on the ground in the mountainous terrain at the time. On November 20th, the Alaskan State Troopers put everything into one last effort to find Thomas. Up until then, they had been flying a 2-seater Super Cub, a slow-flying plane which was ideal for valleys, but it had trouble negotiating the winds in the highlands, which is where Thomas was drawn to. They used a Piper Navajo, a 6-seater, so they can put 4 or 5 spotters up in the air. After 3 days of searching, one plane found a circle drawn on the gravel bar far up on the Ambler River, 8 miles north of the Ulanique Creek. They landed and checked out whether it could be the O from the SOS, yet found no indication that the circle was connected to Seibold. Thomas could have made the sign for himself to mark a place where he left provisions. Because the circle has such strong meaning to Thomas, it seems more than possible that he etched the sign. The plane returned to the site a day later to explore the surrounding area for more clues and to take photos, but there was nothing found. After 6 flights over 13 days, the troopers suspended their search on November 24th as temperatures hit minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. But the task was taken up by family and friends after they had read about successful rescues of others who survived in Arctic conditions for up to 49 days without food, equipment, or training, and Thomas had at least some of all 3. The family and friends contracted privately with 2 of the bush pilots previously employed by the troopers. From the beginning of the search for Seibold, whose disappearance is one of the most mysterious in Alaska, questions have centered on where exactly he was headed when he last left the cabin on or around October 7th. He probably headed to the upper Ambler River drainage, also called the, quote, highlands. On November 29th, the troopers handed over Thomas's remaining belongings from the cabin to the next of kin. An assessment of those belongings and subsequent interviews with the Ambler area residents who met Thomas revealed 3 new clues. A missing map section that Thomas may have with him indicates he had an interest in exploring the headwaters of the Emeliek, Emekkomenek, Cutler, and Redstone rivers along with the Ambler. When he left the original cabin, Thomas handed the owner a book he had just finished reading, The Last Light Breaking by Nick Jans. A well-worn section describes the traditional Eskimo routes through the same headwaters area as on the missing map. Area residents told Thomas's alluring stories of the headwaters area and the beauty and the wildlife, and Thomas read several other books on the area, including Seth Cantoner's bestsellers. A quote from Thomas's last diary entry, quote, "After I've read a lot about this area, it's exciting to actually be here and to see the things with my own eyes," end quote. Seibold also wrote about the possibility of rafting down the Ambler River, up which he traveled in an outboard-powered canoe to catch a flight out of the small village of Ambler itself. Normally, this would be easy to do. Alaska Pacific University wilderness instructor Roman Dial, who had paddled the Ambler in a small one-man inflatable boat called a pack craft, describes the river this way, quote, "Below the Ulanique Creek, the river slows and then braids and really slows on its way to Ambler," end quote. But in October 2012, it was not a normal year in northwest Alaska. The region had heavy rain from late August into September. So although he had built a raft, reports indicate he believed it was too treacherous a challenge. Seibold's decision to abandon the idea of floating out because of changing water conditions is illustrative of a man thinking rationally and coherently. Was Thomas injured whilst hiking, succumbed to hypothermia, or was he attacked by wolves or bears? Most wildlife, like bears, would be safely tucked up in their dens or in hibernation at this time of the year, so animal attack would be unlikely. All these things are possible in the Arctic, and when the temperatures drop so low in the area, there is no room for error. But Thomas was carrying a firearm, it seems. Seibold's story likely ended like that of Chris McCandless, whose body was found in an abandoned bus not far off the George Park Highway in 1992. McCandless was a young man from a well-off East Coast family who starved to death on the edge of the Alaskan wilderness. His story was later to be made famous by author John Krakauer's 1996 book, Into the Wild, which was made into a movie by director Sean Penn in 2007. There was some controversy about the search efforts and the reluctance to engage with the Native American population. Rico DeWild, a young Alaskan entrepreneur who grew up in the Athabascan village of Huslia, south of the search area, who ran his own Fairbanks-based clothing business, said, quote, "From what I talked to people, they didn't even know there was someone missing out there," end quote. Some village search and rescue volunteers in the area told Alaskan Dispatch they were never asked to help in the search, although they did hear about it through the grapevine. Respected Native elder Walter Sampson, once the head of the now closed Civil Air Patrol unit in Seibold, admitted he and a friend flew their own search because they thought too little was being done. DeWild said, quote, "Just flying through the air isn't going to do shit. You got to get some foot soldiers in there. But troopers, they've got so much pride, they never want to work with natives. Those guys living there, they've got ways to find people. And even if the guy was not from out there, I think the natives would want to get his body out of there," end quote. Another person with German roots who has disappeared in a U.S. national park despite Seibold's extensive outdoor and cold weather experience. He has never been found. Will Thomas's remains ever be located? In this huge area of nearly 8.5 million acres, it seems unlikely. Once you go into the gates of the Arctic National Park, with the few that venture there, it's easy never to come out again.